This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of World to Win. I'm very excited to be for the first time with our new co-host Darragh. How are you doing, Darragh?
I'm very well, Yaara. Delighted to be on as well at the same time. I was quite surprised I was asked back on actually, so it's a pleasure to continue on with it now.
Now you're stuck with us forever, Darragh. I'm sorry. You need to come to terms with it. But this episode is going to be one for the history books, the first one of us together. And from now on, it's going to be all easygoing. So tell us about this episode. What are we going to talk about?
Yeah, well, I think over the last number of weeks, we've had quite a lot of discussion on the war, which is definitely, as we reaffirm time and time again, an event that's completely transformed the world as we know it. World relations, but also, I think, class struggle. And I think up to now, our main focus has been on Russia, it's been on Ukraine. We've even discussed the impact of the war in, let's say, Western imperialist bloc and some of the impact it's having there. And we discussed before how the war temporarily, the ruling class, you'd almost feel bad for them. They came into after COVID. They've never been more discredited as they have been before, facing crisis on a number of fronts. But then with the outbreak of war, we discussed in other episodes how historically this has been the case. You get a surge in nationalism. And we've seen the ruling class, no better example than Boris Johnson, who was staring down the crisis of Partygate. But then the war broke out, which he was one of the biggest saber rattlers for, and it temporarily saved his skin. So promoting this idea of national unity, and that resulted in a temporary, but I think the key word there is temporary, strengthening of the centre, of the establishment. But I think already now, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is some of the other consequences the war is having, particularly in parts of what we call the neo-colonial world, some people might call it underdeveloped world, the third world, global south, where we're already seeing the impacts it's having, particularly on the global economy, how it's disrupting supply chains, where all this is adding to just this perfect storm of inflation, of shortages, of stagnant growth, all feeding into just further instability and crisis, which is really, the defining feature of this period, particularly with food prices. So I think that's something that's going to be a feature today, where Ukraine and Russia together account for 12% of the market share of global food calories, which is an incredible statistic. They account for 30% of global exports of wheat and 65% of sunflower. And then some countries, there's even heavier reliance on this. So Lebanon, for example, relies on Ukraine for 80% of its grain. Egypt imports half of its sunflower oil from Ukraine. And then an even more staggering statistic is that 25 African countries import more than 1/3 of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So now we have a situation where Ukraine's wheat fields are now battlefields, and Western sanctions on Russia have accelerated this process of economic decoupling that we've actually spoken about in the show before. I think, something we should come back to. So now we have a situation of surges in energy costs and food prices and shortages of basic supplies, and that's hitting working class people all over the world. In the advanced capitalist countries, Yaara, it's something I think we've talked about here in London and all over England, is just people struggling to cope, the choice between eating and heating because of this cost of living crisis that many people are confronting. But actually the impact in the neo-colonial world is potentially even greater. So a recent Oxfam report would have said that 250 million people could be thrown into extreme poverty this year, and that's less than $1.90 a day. But I think also what we're going to talk about today is we're already seeing that this anger is boiling over into revolt, it's boiling over into protest. Two quite striking examples of that, which have been Sri Lanka and Peru, but also demonstrations and stirrings elsewhere like Sudan, Albania, Iraq. So we're going to discuss that today. So with us to talk about that is two excellent speakers. First, I want to introduce JJ, who's a member of ISA's International Executive and currently based in India at the moment. JJ, how are you doing? What have you been up to in the last period?
Hi, Darragh. I'm good. I mean, been pretty busy politically with everything that's happening. And I mean, yeah, this week my first son started school, which is quite a big event for a parent's life. No, apart from that, yeah, I'm good.
That's great to hear. And then next speaker we have is someone who's been on the show plenty of times, also a member of our International Executive Committee and based in Brazil. It's André. André, how are you doing?
Hi, Darragh. I'm fine. I'm happy to be here with you and Yaara again, and JJ. And I hope we can discuss this important process in the new colonial world and in the world in general.
Excellent. Look forward to getting straight into it. So I want to start with JJ, and just really, I think a question on everyone's mind is trying to understand what's going on today, and exactly how the war is contributing to this surge in food prices. Now, and I'd ask a question: is it the case that the war is the sole cause of the problem? Or why are there loads of other pre-existing issues there? And in that sense, is the war only adding fuel to the flames of a crisis that pre-existed Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think the surge of food prices is not one single cause, and I don't think the war is the only factor. I mean, it's sort of like multi-layered crisis, and it's one that existed already before the war in Ukraine. I mean, at the end of 2021. Global food prices were already at a 10-year high, and that's because of a number of interconnected factors, drought and other extreme weather events affecting crop production being one of them. I mean, just to give an example, already before the war in Ukraine, the prices of durum wheat, which is used to produce pasta, had soared dramatically after Canada, one of its largest producers, witnessed widespread drought and heat waves. You have the issue of supply chain disruptions. And when we say supply chain disruptions, I mean, to be clear, these are not just the temporary glitches because of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns, even though these obviously play a role, but it's also like a more profound fracturing of the globalized supply chain system as we knew it, which is kind of like, going off the rails as a result of the growing tensions and confrontation between major powers on the world stage, US and China in particular, and the rising protectionism and nationalism driving the economic policy of competing capitalist states in this context. And there was already before the war rising fuel prices, generating higher transport costs for food, which the distributors pass on to their customers to preserve their profit margins. Now with the war and the more recent massive hike in fuel prices, this factor is clearly exacerbating the whole situation. But I think the fact that food prices were already surging before the war in Ukraine is a very important point to stress, because it means that even in the unlikely scenario that the war will come to a quick end, there are other underlying factors in the world economy that will keep the pressure on food prices high in any case. But what we have now, with the war, it's like, I mean, what you said in your introduction, it's like a perfect storm, where the lingering effects of the pandemic meets the breaking up of global supply chains, meets a worsening climate crisis, and then on top of this already big pile of issues, you add a major inter-imperialist war, unrolling two of the biggest food and energy exporters in the world, and that creates the sort of like perfect recipe for a very explosive cocktail. I mean, what the United Nations describes as a global food crisis beyond anything we have seen since World War II. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are among the top 5 global exporters of many important foodstuffs, cereals, oilseeds, including wheat, barley, sunflowers, corn, etc. Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of fertilizers as well. And above all, they are both major wheat exporters, with around 50 countries in the world relying on Ukraine and Russia for 30% or more of their wheat supplies. And now the war and its consequences, which include Russia bombing Ukrainian fields and warehouses, its blockade of Ukrainian ports, but also the sweeping trade and financial sanctions imposed on Russia by Western countries, as well as Ukraine's ban on the export of some food products to prevent a domestic humanitarian crisis. All these factors are kind of like, provoking major harvest, supply, and shipment disruptions, which are resulting in these shortages and driving food prices through the roof. You take the case of Lebanon, which you already mentioned. I think you said that Ukraine and Russia combined provide something like 80% of its wheat. But this is a country where already before the war, 4 out of 5 people were food insecure. A country where you had already a situation of hyperinflation, meaning that prices in the shop sometimes can increase several times between the moment you wake up in the morning and the moment you go to bed in the evening. And I mean, there, the fallout from the war in Ukraine means that bread, which is such a central part of people's diets and was still, a relatively affordable option for many poor people before the war, is now also becoming an increasingly unaffordable, almost like a luxury item. But, let's not forget the fact that in the last instance, it all comes down to the fact that food production and distribution under capitalism is organized not to feed people, but to make money. I mean, it's a basic point, but they managed to get truckloads and billions worth of weapons delivered to Ukraine in a very short time. But they wouldn't deliver food and water to starving populations as quickly and efficiently, in the same way that they didn't do it with the COVID vaccine distribution during the peak of the pandemic, because this is not profitable. I mean, it's as simple as that. And in that sense, what I said in the beginning actually is not fully accurate, because there is, at the end of the day, there is one root cause driving all these problems, and that is capitalism itself. So today, for example, only 4 giant companies dominate 75% of grain trading, and they all recorded a surge in their profits last year. So, be sure that this new food crisis won't be lost for everyone, because it creates, mass hunger and misery at one pool, but it creates also, a profit and even speculative opportunities for a tiny few on the other side of the spectrum. Today, you have like millions of people on the brink of famine, not because there isn't enough food available in the world, but because every actor which has a stake in this business needs to make a profit. And because the way, this chaotic for-profit system is organized, basically doesn't allow the food to get to the right mouth at prices people can afford. I mean, that's the real problem.
Yeah, I think, for me, it's kind of this really glaring example of the fact that this war is just another layer of how the rich are creating problems that the poor are paying for. And that is from, the war itself, the fighting itself, and the people who are dying in this war, but also around the world, like you explained, that the consequences of this war, how they exacerbate already existing problems that exist in the society because of the way that society is organized. But I think at the same time, like you said, it's not a problem that was created by the war. It's a problem that we've seen, especially in the neocolonial world, over and over and over again in the last few years, especially. But at the same time, we've also seen kind of like resistance against it, which I think is a really important thing to bring out here, because it can be really depressing to just think about all the people dying from war and from famine. But people are not just dying in a war; they're fighting back against imperialism in a lot of places around the world. It's also the case where people who are dying of lack of food shortages are fighting back. And we've seen since 2019 especially, we've seen a lot of revolutionary movements in the neocolonial world kind of fighting back, especially from the high costs of very basic things. But then we had the pandemic, which obviously caused an even bigger problem and caused millions of people to not just die, but also become even poorer than they were before. So I was wondering, what is the situation now? Are we seeing kind of like a re-emergence of this kind of movement, of these movements around the world? And do you think that is kind of the way that kind of history is going to proceed because of this new situation, like I think Darragh explained as well, that exists in the world right now?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think what we are seeing is that this sort of like a global inflationary spiral, which has now been aggravated by the war in Ukraine, is triggering a new wave of global protest. Basically, with people pushed onto the streets in a whole series of countries already. I mean, some of the flashpoints have already been mentioned: Sri Lanka, Sudan, Peru, which are probably the countries where protests have had so far the highest level of intensity. This is a global phenomenon, and you can feel a sense of nervousness and anxiety among the ruling classes about this. I mean, in the document published last week, for example, the UN warned that the rising food prices threatens what they call knock-on effects of social unrest. A couple of days ago, it was the IMF's turn to kind of ring the alarm bells about the probability for wider social tensions because of energy and food prices rising to what they describe themselves as intolerable levels. And they have all reasons to be worried, of course, because if you look, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa, there is a long history of riots, revolts, and revolutions triggered by hikes in food prices. And the specter of the so-called Arab Spring, for which this issue was a key driver, is now kind of hunting the ruling elites. I mean, in February already, so that was even before the war in Ukraine started, thousands of Palestinians demonstrated in several cities of the West Bank against the increased price of basic goods, with slogans such as "We want to live, no to high prices," etc. Last month, thousands of people protested in Iraq, mostly in the southern regions, which had been already the epicenter of the mass protest movement that took place precisely in 2019. As the price of flour rose by a third and the price of cooking oil doubled literally overnight. And in the city of Nasiriyah, really reflecting the mood, you had demonstrators raising banners with the slogan, "This is a revolution of the hungry," and quite significantly, these protests in Iraq forced the government to announce several measures in the aftermath, like a monthly allowance to poor civil servants and pensioners, as well as to crack down on some of the profiteering traders. I mean, these were mostly limited measures to try and kind of like nip these protests in the bud, but it shows, that the ruling class is kind of sitting on a social powder keg, and I think that's something you can say for pretty much the entire region. There's of course the case of Sudan. I mean, we should remember that the dictator Omar al-Bashir was overthrown just a few months after the tripling of the price of bread in the country. And that revolution started in Atbara, the very same city where fresh protests against rising prices erupted last month, along with an open strike by railway workers over their low wages and the delays in their wages payment. So, like in Iraq, the elements of continuity also with the mass revolutionary struggles of 2019 are pretty clear, And in a country like Sudan, the food situation is absolutely terrible. I mean, according to the World Food Programme, more than 18 million Sudanese will face acute hunger by the end of this year. I mean, that's double the number of last year. And again, you see here the war in Ukraine played kind of a big role in making a situation that was already bad considerably worse, because Sudan's dependence on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine is among the highest in the whole of Africa. I think it's around 75% of its wheat imports which come from these two countries alone. But of course, like everywhere else, there are national factors involved as well. I think it would be simplistic. And in fact, it's a convenient excuse for the rulers in many places to attribute everything to the war as if it was totally out of their control. Because in a country like Sudan, there is an ongoing power struggle between the revolutionary masses and a thoroughly corrupt and brutal military regime, which has seized all power in a military coup last October, following which there was already a collapse in living standards. And that regime is headed by generals, security officials, and warlords who control key portions of the country's economy, who have enriched themselves massively at the expense of the majority of the population, and who have over the last 2 or 3 years slashed the state subsidies on fuel, on electricity, on flour, on cooking gas, on pretty much everything, while at the same time dedicating much of the state budget on military means and on the control and repression of the masses. So, the recent protests we have seen there are not just an immediate reaction to price increases. They have, sort of added on to an ongoing movement of resistance and opposition to the military junta. And in these protests, the rejection of military rule, has remained a central part of the people's demands. In Iran, to name another country, in recent weeks, you had municipal workers, oil workers, telecommunication workers, teachers, who have all gone on strike to demand increases to their wages and pensions. In Turkey, there has been a sharpening of the class struggle recently as well, with a large wave of strikes shaping many sectors since the beginning of this year to demand, again, wage increases in line with the soaring inflation. So just to give a number, at least 108 strikes were recorded in Turkey just in January and February of this year, which is more than the average annual total seen in previous years. And it has also stimulated the drive for new layers of workers towards the trade unions. And I think there are many other countries that could and will face similar developments in that region in particular. I mean, in other regions too, of course, but I think the Middle East and North Africa is particularly exposed because it's a region highly dependent on food imports from Russia and Ukraine. So the war can be the sort of factor tipping the whole situation over.
Yeah, thanks very much, JJ. I like how you explained about, the novel situation created by the war and its consequences, but also the continuity with these extremely powerful movements that, that have unresolved demands and, continue to see mobilizations today. But related to that, actually, and one of the places that over the last number of weeks where perhaps we've seen one of the more developed movements take place is in Peru. And Andre, you've been on before where we've previously discussed some of the significant political events that have taken place there. In 2020, we had protests against the planned coup, this period of enormous political instability. Following on from that, we saw the electoral breakthrough from the left last year with Pedro Castillo, which was a big talking point, I think, around the world because he came from relatively nowhere. Here was this rural trade unionist teacher who, I think there was a story where CNN didn't even have a picture of him because he was such an outsider, but tapped into this mood of mass anger and came from nowhere, narrowly beaten out the Keiko Fujimori, daughter of Alberto Fujimori, former dictator of Peru, the far-right candidate. And quite a relatively bold program where we talked about how no one should be rich in a poor country like Peru, talked about nationalization, talking about radical redistribution of wealth. But we're only 8 months into this this new left government, this new progressive government, and already it's entered into quite a profound crisis in which a movement has taken place triggered by this very similar things that JJ have just been talking about: rising fuel, rising food, so I think it would be great, Andre, if you kind of give us more of an insight of how this movement really got going and what does it mean now for the Castillo government.
Yeah, it's true, Darragh. I think that in the case of Peru, the rise in fuel and food prices, some of the effects of the war in Ukraine, worked like throwing petrol on the fire. Because Peru had been facing a deep political, economic and social crisis even before the war in Ukraine. The protests that started more than a couple of weeks ago reflect the deepening of this situation. We have, as you said, spoken here in the War to Win before about Pedro Castillo's election and the general political crisis in Peru. You know that the election of Pedro Castillo came after the fall of 3 of the country's presidents. For example, Manuel Merino was forced to resign in the late 2020 by the force of a powerful mass movement. It's not too much to recall that practically all of the country's presidents of the last 30 years have responded to judicial proceedings for corruption or human rights violations. Many were imprisoned, and one of them, Alan Garcia, for example, committed suicide just as he was about to be arrested. So Peru was also one of the countries that suffered most from the pandemic and the economic crisis. Until now, there have been 215,000 deaths from COVID-19 in a population of 33 million people. It is the worst mortality rate in the world. There have been 6,300 deaths per million inhabitants in Peru. Among the many consequences of this tragedy are the so-called COVID orphans, some 93,000 children who lost their parents during the pandemic. So at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, the Peruvian economy suffered an 11% drop in GDP, with evident increases in poverty and social inequality. The record growth of 13% of GDP last year did not solve the country's social, political, and economic problems. So Pedro Castillo was elected president last year as a popular response to this crisis. As you said, he defeated in the second round Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of the dictator Alberto Fujimori. And Castillo was elected with the support of the majority of the workers and peasants, and he only assumed the presidency of the country because there was a great popular mobilization against the attempts of the right wing and the extreme right wing to not recognize the electoral result and prevent his inauguration. So the Peruvian right wing and the ruling class from the beginning trying to destabilize and overthrow the new government. The Castillo's response, however, was not to rely on popular mobilizations to promote profound transformations in Peruvian society and in this way impose a defeat of the right wing. Castillo preferred to seek a path of reconciliation with the right. He abandoned the project of nationalizing the mining companies, for example, and also changing the country's constitution. This constitution in Peru, it was a constitution made by in 1993 under the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori. So, in essence, he did not break with the neoliberal model adopted in the country in the last decades. So Castillo ousted the prime minister, the president of the Council of Ministers, that was linked with his party, Peru Libre, just in the beginning of his government, and began to replace ministers considered to be from the left, too much from the left, to more moderate, more even right-wing representatives. Since Castillo took office 9 months ago, he has already formed 4 different cabinets and replaced 30 ministers, which is the equivalent of 1 every week. So as a consequence, Castillo has lost popular support, but has not been able to contain the attacks from the right wing, which continues to systematically try to unseat him through parliament maneuvers. So, but the Congress, the parliament, is also the target of strong popular rejection also. So the latest polls indicate that while on the one hand 76% of the population reject Castillo's government, on the other side 82% rejected the current Congress of the country. So inflation in the country in last March was the highest since August 1998 and continues to rise. Official unemployment is close to 10%. The high prices of fertilizers and food and petrol triggered protests, beginning with the truck drivers, peasants, but also workers and other sectors. The protests began with the truck drivers on 28 March, and the movement expanded in the following days, leading to roadblocks across the country. The government's first response was to decree a curfew in Lima and Callao. The clashes with the repressive forces have already led to 6 deaths as a consequence. So the government then ended up lifting the curfew, much criticized by leftist forces and the social movements, and they announced an increase of 10% in the minimum wage and also a reduction on fuel taxes and other taxes, but with little concrete effect. So the protests continued, especially from April 7, this time with more effective participation of the workers' unions, the CGTP, and the SUTEP, the education workers, the teachers' trade union, the sector where Castillo himself comes from. So this trade union, these teachers' trade union leaders called on the government to change its policies, to change course, or else resign. So they demanded the resumption of the program of change that Castillo defended in the electoral campaign. And the process of mobilization was really an authentic popular and workers' response to the crisis. But obviously, the right wing is also trying to use the crisis to destabilize Castillo's government. But also, the ruling elite in Peru also fear about the strength of the popular movement. In recent days, the region of Cusco, the historical capital of the Inca civilization, where Machu Picchu is located, etc., is experiencing a general strike. It's a region with every year you have 1 million tourists. At this moment, live in a general strike, a 48 hours general strike, paralyzing almost all the activities in the region. So the potential for struggles still remains, and so does the stability of the government. What is needed is to build channels of organization and independent struggle for workers, peasants, and the poor people, and to arm this struggle with a program to break with the neoliberal policies and the corrupt political system in the country. This means rescuing the banners of change that Castillo raised in the election and ended up abandoning, like for example, the nationalization of the mining and changing the constitution, etc., but also going even further, pointing in an anti-capitalist and socialist perspective. That is the way for the movement needs to follow in the next period.
Thanks very much, André, for that very comprehensive answer that really put things in their context of previous movements we saw in Peru that really brought Castillo to power. I mean, one thing to me that is quite striking is that how the government of Castillo that came to power on a program with popular support from working class people and peasants so quickly entered in crisis. And why is that? Well, it's not like the previous cycle of, the pink tide governments that people are talking about now. Pedro Castillo inherited a situation of crisis on every front, and he's by following that road of compromise. It hasn't, with his wiggle room, his space for maneuver within this much more crisis-prone capitalist system is much less in this period, which also means that's not just isolated to Peru, but actually something that we're going to see all over Latin America. Some of the same problems of inflation, of food insecurity, of economic stagnation are also problems that other countries are grappling with as well. So, André, I'd like to ask you about that. Are other Latin American countries facing a similar situation, and how is this likely to play out over the next period?
Yeah, well, I think that the war in Ukraine, while distant from the region, has enormous implications for Latin America. Political implications, geopolitical implications, economic and social, and also on consciousness. And we cannot underestimate this, and this will be a mark of the next period. So inflation is a problem affecting all Latin America, and it mainly affects the poorest sectors of the population. So with high inflation, there is a tendency to raise the interest rates, which leads to low growth, worsening unemployment, and thus the specter of stagflation also looms in the region. Chile, for example, raised interest rates in February for the first time in 20 years. In Mexico and Colombia, the inflation in March reached 1%, and projections are for even higher growth in the coming period. Argentina, for example, has been facing a serious social crisis that tends to get worse. Inflation in Argentina is officially above 50% per year, even with the policy of the price freeze from the government at the end of the last year. So now the scenario could get worse. There are shortages, long queues in supermarkets, and prices are readjusted every week. 40% of the Argentinian population lives in poverty. 65% of children are poor in Argentina at this moment. And Argentina is still tangled up with its foreign debt. And the recent agreement with the IMF will not represent more stability, but on the contrary, counter reforms, attacks, and this will not solve the problem. So the more indebted countries in the region, like Argentina and Ecuador, may suffer more from the crisis. Large demonstrations have already taken place in Argentina against the IMF agreement and its consequences, and this struggle is likely to continue in the coming period. In Brazil, inflation has exceeded 10% by 2021. In March, inflation was 1.62%, the highest since 1994, and the inflation was stimulated mainly by the rise in fuel, transport, food prices, etc., as in the other countries. And if we add the effects of the war in Ukraine with the climate crisis, the scenario gets worse. The water crisis in Brazil has directly affected the generation of energy in hydroelectric plants and has pushed up electricity prices in the country. So even before the crisis generated by the war in Ukraine, more than half of the Brazilian population, around 110 million people, were experiencing food insecurity. Of these people, around 20 million are in a serious situation. So this is an explosive situation, especially if we consider the scenario of social struggles in Latin America since 2019. The social and economic situation today is worse than it was in 2019. And that is why we are seeing a new wave of progressive governments being elected in the region. And after the recent election of Boric in Chile, there is the perspective of the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia in the May 29 elections. Lula is still the favorite in Brazilian October elections. And in the case of Brazil, but also in other countries, the imminence of election, the perspective of elections and the possibility of political change means that much of the popular dissatisfaction is channeled into disputes within the political institutions, within parliamentary electoral logic, etc. But a response within the order, the political order within the system, will not be able to attend popular demands completely, and struggles are inevitable. So Latin America, the Latin American reality in the coming period will be one of a social and political polarization, deepening the crisis, major mass struggles, and new progressive governments being put to the test. And also, evidently, we also have the ultra-right forces trying to take advantage of the limits and deficiencies of the left and center-left forces in the region. One of the lessons of the Peruvian process is the need for the left and the social and working class movements to prepare themselves to build the struggle by questioning the basis of the capitalist system, which is what generates the crisis. So the path, the way of class conciliation adopted by Castillo proved to be a failure in Peru, but also in Brazil and in other countries of the region.
I think we are seeing all of this rage, and I think you made a really important point there, André, about how kind of like even in the kind of normal kind of parliamentary way, we're still seeing kind of the consciousness change. But I also think that like combined with the movements on the streets, we're seeing this real rage that just needs to be directed and using the strategies of the working class to be able to actually defeat the problems that we're seeing on an international level. And I think it's really interesting to see how these movements are basically happening across the world. You know, we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about North Africa and the Middle East, and obviously South Asia as well. And I think it's really important to see that this is in the minds of people as well, all connected on an international level. And I wanted to come back to a point that JJ made a few moments ago about the so-called Arab Spring, you know, or if anything, I want to go back 11 years in time to it, because obviously, for those of us who remember it, those movements started from a similar situation of very sharp hikes in prices. And I was wondering, JJ, because obviously you wrote a really fantastic book about Tunisia as well, which is really recommended. It will be in the description box for you to look at, everyone watching us. But also, I think the points that you made about how there are some similarities. I was wondering if you can kind of talk us through those similarities, and do you think that the movements now have the potential to grow to the level that the Arab Spring did, and then maybe beyond, and be even more successful in kind of the conclusions of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of parallels and similarities with the situation back 11 or 10 years ago and the situation today. I can't remember the exact quote, but Karl Marx once said, that when the productive forces cannot develop anymore within the confines of the existing economic system or mode of production, society enters an era of social revolution, something along those lines. And I think this incapacity of capitalism to drive society forward is stagnation and even regression of the productive forces with mass youth unemployment, obscene inequalities, the blatant corruption and parasitism of the ruling elites, the increasingly suffocating, brutalizing and repressive political atmosphere. This is what drove people to rise up in their millions during the so-called Arab Spring in that region. And all these factors are still there, They've actually been compounded in most cases over the last decade, There is an economist called Michael Tenchum, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, but basically he calculated that the level of inflation for food products in that region had reached the exact same level as in the immediate build-up to the so-called Arab Spring in June 2021, so in the middle of last year. But since then, of course, the prices have gone much further than that. And I don't know if you remember, but at the time of the Tunisian revolution, you could see pictures of demonstrators protesting with the baguettes, the French bread in their hands. One of the most popular slogans of the Egyptian revolution was bread, freedom, and social justice. So it shows how explosive this issue of bread and food prices, which is now back with full force, can become. But of course, that's not the only issue. Inequalities have exploded further. I mean, just for the anecdote, it was revealed recently that the former royal couple of Dubai spent $3 million on strawberries in one single summer. And in the meantime, millions of people can barely feed themselves. Unemployment and corruption are as rampant as they were back then. And even, the promises of democracy have been completely shattered. Even Tunisia, since last year, is now on a fast track to new autocracy, basically, with the president Said having monopolized power and dismantled the parliament. And now he's on a rampage against democratic rights. And as we explained when the first move towards that happened last year, unless Said was ready to mobilize the masses, challenge the economic power of the country's super wealthy, the speculators, the large corporations, the IMF, etc., he wouldn't have the necessary resources to preserve the support base that had initially welcomed his power back, in the vain expectation that he would somewhat solve their problems, And now the serious economic crisis hitting the country, which has been dramatically accelerated by the conflict in Ukraine, is kind of bringing this whole reality to the fore. We have supporters of ISA in Tunis, and they report that in supermarkets, some shelves remain empty for weeks. It has become a struggle to find basic stuff like flour, sugar, eggs, etc. And everything like food, petrol, medicine has become much more expensive. There are long queues in front of bakeries to get bread. There are increasing delays in the payment of public sector wages, and so on and so forth. And in this context, the popularity of the president has already been seriously eroded. So we see the political effect this is already having. Egypt is, as the world's largest wheat importer, is not in a better place. Quite the opposite. Beyond all the problems already listed, the war in Ukraine has also deprived Egypt of another important source of income, which is tourism, because almost a third of its tourist inflows in recent years came from Russia and Ukraine. And as we often say, the chain of capitalism tends to break at its weakest link. That's what we saw, during the so-called Arab Spring, and that's what we can see in the future as well. I mean, Sri Lanka, for naming, what's happening in Asia, is clear from that point of view. But also from that point of view, I think, when you look at the Middle East and North Africa, it's quite interesting to note that precisely Egypt and Tunisia, the two countries that originated the revolutions of 2010 and 11, are now, both back in the eye of an economic storm, really. Like for many low-income countries in the neo-colonial world and so on, the war in Ukraine is accelerating these countries' debt crisis as they face, rising costs for their imports, rising borrowing costs because of the tightening of monetary policies by Western central banks, and declining economic growth as well. So they are now both on the verge of debt default and are in talks with the IMF to get bailed out. And that will be done in exchange of what the IMF itself describes as deep structural reforms. And we all know what that means. It means this government will have to resort to policies such as wage freezes, cuts in subsidies, and cuts in other crucial social spending like health and education, currency devaluations and the likes. And all of this in the very midst of a massive surge in food and energy prices. And I mean, you don't really need to be an expert to work out, that a situation like this is a one-way ticket to social and political upheavals, including the possibility, absolutely, for new mass revolutionary movements. Of course, we can never be sure how exactly things will unfold, and it will involve, more negative developments as well, more vicious cycles of counter-revolution, perhaps, mass outflow of refugees, possible new wars in the region, and so on. But I think if we can be certain of one thing is that, the barbaric conditions capitalism is driving people into will mean millions of poor and workers will be left with no other choice but to fight back to secure their survival. And that's, really brings to light the emergency of, the question of political organization of the working class, the youth and the masses in the region and across the world to be able to, have a more successful outcome than what happened a decade ago.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see these kind of parallels that existed, because we have been in over a decade now of upheavals. We've had kind of crisis leading to another crisis, leading to another crisis, and we're seeing it particularly in the neo-colonial world, but I think all across the world, working class people are feeling this burden of the contradictions within the capitalist system. And obviously, when we're talking about the Arab Spring, there's a lot of lessons that need to be learned for the movements that are hopefully and are pretty likely are going to continue arising now with a similar situation, just, I guess, after people have been more and more worn down in the last decade. So, André, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is needed to genuinely fight these kind of rises in prices, the war, the lowering of conditions around the world, and especially in the neo-colonial world? How can we learn from the Arab Spring and from the struggles that happened before, and what is actually needed to defeat this now?
Yes, I think that is a fundamental question. What is the way out of the crisis, and what program and what strategy of struggle is necessary for the working class in this increasingly dramatic situation? I think that the Arab Spring is an example of the necessity of a program that can answer this dramatic situation and can put a strategy forward in terms of for the working class to be successful in his struggle. And so the necessity of a program and building political forces that can answer that is very important. I think that the situation we are living now, for example, as some bourgeois commentators have already said, this war in Ukraine is a global war, in terms that it reflects a larger inter-imperialist dispute, a process of profound transformations in international capitalism, and affects the whole world. And I think that in this context, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the whole world are in a situation where we need to understand the changing in the situation and the tasks for the left and the working class. So in this context, for Latin America, for example, there is no possible way out of the crisis. For example, if you confront this inter-imperialist dispute by aligning itself with either side in this conflict. Any illusion that China or even Russia represent a better way forward than that of Western imperialism domination, for example, could be fatal and could disarm the mass movement. And I think this is a factor. This is a debate also in Latin America, for example. If you look, for example, the dilemma in Venezuela, for example, part of what was the Chavista left in the past is today divided between those who want to promote a kind of reconciliation with the United States, which now needs Venezuelan oil, for example, and they are a bit more open to renegotiate the situation with Venezuela, and those who want to continue betting on the relation and also the dependence on China and Russia, for example. I think that this is not the way out for the crisis. The way out of the crisis is through the independent struggle of the working class and its unity with the movements of the oppressed sectors of society, the indigenous peoples, the women's movement, the black people's movement, etc. So the strength of this struggle has already been demonstrated by the popular uprisings since 2019 in Ecuador, Chile, Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru itself, etc. Working class organizations must rise a program capable of attending popular demands and making the super rich elite pay the price of the crisis and not the workers and the poor. In this program, it is necessary to raise demands like the freezing of fuel, gas, and food prices, together with the control of supply by workers organized in a democratic way. We must fight for a general increase in wages and pensions, an end to job insecurity and informality, reduction of the working days to create jobs. And it's also fundamental to implement radical agrarian reform with expropriation with the big owners, landowners, the latifundios. And with this, we will have food production for the people and also at the same time the defense of the environment. So nationalization with workers' control of the mines and oil production that is a demand in Peru and also in other countries is fundamental to guarantee the sovereignty of the Latin American peoples over their own wealth, but at the same time, because it can contain the destruction of the environment. Only the working class in control of this means of production can really have a plan that can defend the environment. So the non-payment of the internal and external debts to the big capitalists and the reversion of these resources to pay the social debt to the people through housing, health, education, job creation, etc. And together with this, to avoid the flight of capital and the reaction of the big capitalists, it will be necessary to nationalize the banks and the financial system with workers' control. So also nationalization of the companies that, for example, lay off workers and the nationalization of the key sectors of the economy. It's necessary so that we can have an economy democratically planned by the working class. So some elements of a really anti-capitalist and socialist program can organize broad sectors of the working class and oppressed people, mobilize them, and create the foundations for a genuine workers' government in each country in the direction of regional integration in the case of Latin America, the perspective, for example, of a socialist federation of Latin America, but also in a perspective of a socialist world. And I think that this program is fundamental to be raised by the forces of the left, the socialist left in the world at this moment. ISA is working to help building the political forces necessary to defend this program among the working class and the oppressed people. And I think that that's the moment to build ISA and our forces in all the world more than ever.
Thank you so much, André. I think this is a brilliant kind of point to finish on, to kind of call everyone to join us. Obviously, International Socialist Alternative has members and activists in over 30 countries around the world. So wherever you are, you can join us and we can build this movement that André and JJ were talking about together. So don't forget to leave us your details if you're not already a member. And I want to say a big thank you to both André and JJ for being here with us. I'm sure that this episode is going to be really useful for a lot of people. I know that it was very useful for me as well. I feel so much more knowledgeable about it. And I think that this is going to be a really big thing that's going to develop continuously, whether there's a war or not, with kind of like the fluctuation of prices. So it's really important that we understand where it comes from and also how to fight back. So thank you again, André and JJ, and see you very soon. And now for our favourite part of every episode, the shout out of the week. And I want to ask you, Darragh, what are we going to shout out about?
Well, I'm particularly excited about this one because it's for two very important comrades, Neil Moore and Amy Ferguson, who are both going to be contesting the Assembly elections in Northern Ireland next month. Two of them are outstanding young trade union activists, and they're standing on a very bold programme to take up workers' rights, gender oppression, environmental destruction, but also fighting against sectarianism and pointing a way forward for working class unity. So it's a very dynamic campaign of, driven by young people and workers, and wish them all the best, and hopefully one of us might get over to assist them at some stage.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're in Northern Ireland, check out whether you can vote for them or whether they're in your constituency. And really, congratulations for kind of going on this campaign. We're obviously all behind you. And anyone who's watching this and doesn't know Neil and Amy and doesn't know what we do in Northern Ireland and how our organisation is fighting against capitalism, but also sectarianism, like Darragh said, make sure to check out our section in Ireland and specifically in the north to see kind of the program, because there's so much that they're doing that is brilliant. So thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and see you in 2 weeks.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!